a matter of time. I want my people to be free, to be free, to be free. The sun still shines. The sun still shines.
Welcome back to It's a Matter of Time. This is our 7th and final deep dive into Life Ain't Fair by San Philo. Over the past few weeks, we've really dug into Philo's argument about Florida's overuse of life without parole sentences and how it's a system that hits taxpayers hard without actually making our streets safer.
Yeah, and today we're going to take a different approach. Imagine hopping into a time machine to trace how this system evolved. We'll start way back in 1865 and work our way up to the present day, connecting the dots between history and the system we see in Florida now.
Exactly. And you know what's really fascinating? This journey through time actually reveals how the system's impact is felt by you, the listener.
Right.
Right here, right now.
It's not just some abstract legal issue happening far away. It affects your community, your tax dollars, and ultimately, the kind of Florida you live in.
Okay, let's fire up that time machine and set the dial for 1865, the year the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. A huge turning point in American history, right? But here's the catch, and Philo makes this point really clear. Florida quickly found new ways to exploit labor, especially targeting Black individuals. It's like they just swapped one system of control for another.
Definitely. And you see this play out when, in 1868, Florida establishes its Department of Corrections. The very same year, the 14th Amendment promises equal protection under the law. This is a huge contradiction.
Wow.
On one hand, there's the ideal of equality, and on the other, the creation of a system that would disproportionately impact Black Floridians.
It really makes you question the true meaning of progress, right?
Absolutely.
Now get this, the first person ever imprisoned in Florida, a man named Calvin Williams, received a 1-year sentence for larceny. That's stealing, basically.
Yeah.
Now imagine that. In today's Florida, that same crime could get you locked up for life without parole.
That drastic shift in sentencing is exactly what Philo unpacks throughout the book. And understanding how we got here means looking at the bigger picture, the political climate, the war on drugs, and how the idea of tough on crime became a dominant force in shaping policy.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit to the early 1900s. Florida's convict leasing system was in full swing. Basically, private companies would rent prisoners.
Right.
A system that eerily echoes the exploitation of slavery. They were put to work in grueling conditions, building much of the state's infrastructure that we still use today.
Oh, yeah.
Think about that. The roads you drive on, the buildings you visit, maybe even some of the tourist spots you enjoy, all built on a system of forced labor.
Wow.
And this wasn't just some hidden secret. Back in 1907, Cosmopolitan magazine, yes, that Cosmopolitan, called out Florida for having the system that was basically slavery by another name. It's a chilling reminder of how these patterns of exploitation, particularly against marginalized communities, can persist.
Even when we think we've moved past them.
Yeah. But hold on. Things weren't always this extreme when it came to life sentences. Were they?
I mean, not necessarily.
Philo points out that in the 1970s, the average time served on a life sentence was under 6 years. That's a far cry from dying in prison.
Yeah, that's a big difference. There was a period of relative leniency in the 70s, but the 1980s saw a dramatic shift. Crime rates were rising, the war on drugs was ramping up, and there was this fear-mongering about so-called super predators. It was a term used to describe young offenders, often Black and brown youth, painting them as inherently dangerous and beyond rehabilitation.
Super predators, that's some loaded language.
Yeah.
And this is where things really took a turn.
Yeah.
In 1983, Florida abolished parole, and if you got a life sentence, you were literally going to die in prison.
This marked a fundamental change in the philosophy of the justice system. Rehabilitation and second chances were out the window. Punishment was the only goal, regardless of the individual or their potential for change.
And so here we are in the present day. Florida leads the world in life without parole sentences. We have more people serving LWOP than the entire federal prison system. It's mind-blowing.
It's a lot, and even the federal government has acknowledged that their own reliance on LWOP is unsustainable. They're starting to question its effectiveness and the enormous financial burden it places on taxpayers. So if they're saying it's too much, why is Florida doubling down?
That's a great question, especially when you consider the costs. We're talking over $334 million every year just to keep people in prison for life. often for crimes they committed as young adults. That's enough money to fund entire programs across the state, like affordable housing or job training,
Right, yeah.
which could actually help prevent crime in the first place.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Studies show that a significant portion of Florida's LWOP population, over half in fact, pose no real threat to public safety. So why are we spending millions to keep them locked up?
It just doesn't add up. But beyond the financial costs, there's also a tremendous human cost to this system. Florida sentences more kids to die in prison than almost any other state, even though the Supreme Court has ruled that it can be cruel and unusual punishment.
It's tough.
Think about that for a second. These are children, teenagers, their brain's still developing, making mistakes.
Yeah.
And we're condemning them to a lifetime behind bars. We're talking about extinguishing any chance they have at redemption.
Yeah.
Or a meaningful life.
Yeah.
And it's not just children. Philo also highlights the case of emerging adults, those between 18 and 21.
Right. That's a critical time
Right.
in life where you're still figuring things out. Your brain is still maturing and you have the potential to grow and change. But in Florida, we're slapping these young people with LWOP, essentially saying that their worst mistake defines their entire lives.
And let's be honest, there's a clear racial disparity at play here. A staggering 66% of emerging adults serving LWOP in Florida are Black. This echoes the system's long history of targeting and marginalizing Black communities, going all the way back to those exploitative labor practices we talked about earlier.
Absolutely.
It's a sobering reminder that the legacy of racial injustice isn't something confined to history books. It's woven into the fabric of our current system.
Right.
So with all this said, what can we actually do about it? Luckily, Philo doesn't just present the problems, he offers some solutions, right?
Absolutely. He talks about programs like the REAP program, a model for evaluating rehabilitation based on actual evidence and risk assessment tools, not just gut feelings or political agendas. It's about moving away from emotionally charged rhetoric and towards a more data-driven approach, recognizing that people can change and that we have ways to measure that change effectively.
That's right. It's about giving people the tools and the opportunity to prove they've turned their lives around and earn back the trust they might have broken. And you know what's really interesting is that Philo highlights how many LWOP inmates are already doing this, working to better themselves and contribute positively, even without the promise of ever getting out again.
It's a powerful point. He shares stories of individuals serving LWOP who have become mentors to other inmates, who are teaching classes, even starting small businesses within the prison walls. They're not giving up on themselves, even when the system has given up on them.
It just makes you think about all that untapped potential, all that wasted human capital.
Right,
But it's not just the human cost, right?
right.
Philo also dives into the economic side of things and lays out a pretty convincing case for why reforming LWOP sentencing could actually save taxpayers a lot of money.
The numbers are pretty stark. It costs taxpayers over $27,000 a year to incarcerate someone in Florida. But to supervise someone in the community, it's only around $3,000. Now imagine if even a third of Florida's LWOP population were deemed eligible for release under strict supervision. We're talking about potential savings of hundreds of millions of dollars annually.
Hundreds of millions, that's incredible. Think of what could be done with that money. Investing in education,
Right,
improving our infrastructure,
right.
supporting social services,
Right.
things that could actually make our communities safer and stronger.
Exactly. It's not just about saving money, though. Philo also talks about the potential for these individuals to actually contribute to the economy. He proposes the idea of second chance communities, which are transitional housing programs that not only provide support and structure for people re-entering society, but also require residents to contribute financially.
So it's not about giving anyone a free pass. It's about accountability, about people demonstrating their commitment to becoming self-sufficient and giving back to the community they once harmed.
Precisely. Residents would pay for their housing, their supervision, any counseling or treatment they receive. It's a way to help them get back on their feet, while also ensuring they're taking responsibility for their past actions.
That's such a smart approach. It seems like it would benefit everyone involved, the individual, the community, and even the state's budget. Now, speaking of taking responsibility, Philo brings up another really important concept, restitution. He argues that we need to shift our focus from just punishing the offender to also addressing the needs of the victim and the community as a whole.
It's a crucial point. The current system often leaves victims feeling like they're on the sidelines. They might get to make a statement at sentencing, but then they're left to deal with the trauma and the consequences of the crime on their own. Incarceration might provide a sense of retribution, but it doesn't necessarily address the victim's need for healing and closure.
Right. It doesn't actually help them move forward with their lives. So what does Philo suggest? How do we bring restitution into the picture?
He talks about incorporating more restitution-based practices into the system. This could involve things like community service, financial compensation to the victim, even victim-offender mediation programs, where the victim and the offender have a chance to meet face-to-face and work towards reconciliation.
That sounds really powerful, especially that mediation piece. Giving victims a voice and a chance to be heard can be incredibly healing. But what about the offender? How does restitution impact them?
It can foster a sense of accountability and empathy. Instead of just sitting in a cell, they're actively involved in repairing the harm they caused. They're forced to confront the real-world consequences of their actions and take concrete steps to make things right.
It seems like a much more constructive approach, one that focuses on healing and restoration rather than just punishment. Now, I know some people might think this sounds a little too idealistic, maybe even naive.
I understand that concern. But what I appreciate about Philo's work is that he's not just appealing to our emotions. He's grounding his arguments in hard data and real-world examples. He's presenting a compelling case for why this kind of approach could actually lead to a safer, more just society.
It makes you wonder why we haven't embraced these ideas more fully already.
Well, Philo argues that there are powerful forces at play that resist change, particularly when it comes to the prison industrial complex. He highlights how private companies are making huge profits off of mass incarceration.
It's almost as if they have a vested interest in keeping people locked up. But that's a conversation for another time, perhaps.
Indeed. For now, I think it's important for listeners to consider what Philo has laid out in Life Ain't Fair, the historical context, the current realities of the system, and the possibilities for a different future.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really stuck with me was this question Philo poses. What does rehabilitation actually mean? It's a word we hear a lot, but what does it look like in practice? How do we measure it?
It's easy to throw that word around. But Philo encourages us to dig deeper. He says true rehabilitation isn't just about saying the right words. It's about demonstrating a genuine change in behavior, a commitment to making amends, to reaping what you sow, as he puts it.
So how do we assess that genuine change? How do we know if someone is truly rehabilitated?
That's where programs like the REAP program come in. It's about using standardized, evidence-based methods to evaluate an individual's progress. We're not talking about relying on gut feelings or subjective opinions, but looking at concrete data. Have they participated in educational programs, developed job skills, maintained a clean disciplinary record, expressed remorse, and taken responsibility for their actions?
It's about giving people the tools and the opportunity to prove they've changed, to earn back the trust they've broken. And you know what's really interesting is that Philo highlights how many LWOP inmates are already doing this, working to better themselves and contribute positively, even without the promise of ever getting out.
It's a powerful point. He shares stories of individuals serving LWOP who have become mentors to other inmates, who are teaching classes, so they're not giving up on themselves, even when the system has given up on them.
And like we talked about earlier, back in the day, it was chain gangs and convict leasing.
Right.
Today, it's these private companies profiting off the captive market of incarcerated people. Think about it, they're making millions, sometimes billions, by charging exorbitant prices for phone calls, commissary items, even basic services like money transfers.
It's a system that preys on the vulnerabilities of incarcerated individuals and their families. And the truly disheartening part is that this system is often supported by the very lawmakers who campaign on being tough on crime.
It's like a twisted irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Philo really drives this point home when he talks about how these companies spend millions lobbying politicians, pushing for harsher sentences and regulations that stifle competition. It creates this vicious cycle where the focus is on profits, not on rehabilitation or public safety.
And ultimately, it's the taxpayers who end up footing the bill for this broken system. Philo argues that true public safety requires a much broader approach, one that addresses the root causes of crime, like poverty, lack of opportunity, and systemic inequality.
He's challenging us to rethink our entire definition of justice. Is it really about revenge and punishment, locking people up and throwing away the key? Or should we be focusing on accountability?
Right.
On giving people a chance to repair the harm they've caused and become productive members of society?
These are questions that each of us as citizens and as human beings need to grapple with. And I think Philo's book gives us the tools and the knowledge to have those conversations, to challenge our own assumptions, and to push for a more just and equitable system.
I think that's what makes this book and this entire deep dive so important. It's not just about abstract theories or statistics. It's about real lives, real people who are being impacted by these policies every single day.
And it feels like we're at a critical turning point. Philo paints a pretty stark picture of Florida's prison system being stretched to its breaking point. Overcrowding, understaffing, violence, it's a crisis waiting to happen.
It's a ticking time bomb. And the longer we wait to address these issues, the more it's going to cost us financially and morally. We can't keep kicking the can down the road.
Thankfully, Philo doesn't just leave us with a sense of doom and gloom. He outlines specific steps we can take. Reforming LWOP sentencing, investing in rehabilitation programs, implementing restitution-based practices, supporting those second chance initiatives we talked about. It's all within reach, but it requires action.
And that action starts with us, the citizens. We need to demand change from our elected officials, support organizations working towards reform, and have those tough conversations with our friends and families.
It's about shifting the narrative, moving away from fear and retribution.
Thank you for joining us on this final deep dive into Life Ain't Fair. We hope this journey has inspired you to stay engaged, to keep learning, and to be a part of the solution.
Remember, the power to create a more just and humane world lies within each of us.
I just wanna sit with you, conversate.